All right, welcome everyone who has joined so far. I'm going to give it one more minute because I see people are still streaming in here. All right, welcome everyone to today's Soil, Water, and Climate seminar. If you don't know me, I'm Kelly Wells. I'm a research scientist in the department and a co-organizer of the seminar series along with Vasudha Sharma and Kyle Shervine. I'm going to introduce you to today's speaker in a minute, but first just want to mention that our next seminar will be in 2 weeks from today, March 17th, and that will be with Shalini Gupta, who is a researcher and local environmental justice advocate. But today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Andrea Basche, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she leads the Resilient Cropping Systems Lab. Andrea received her PhD from Iowa State University in Agronomy and Sustainable Agriculture in 2015. And today she is speaking on considering the who and how to achieve landscape diversification and conservation goals. So I will turn it over to you, Andrea.
Well, thank you, Kelly and Amy and Anna Cates for the invitation and that introduction, Kelly. It's really a pleasure to get to talk with your department. I've always found just the different resources included in what is studied in your group to be diverse and important. And, you know, I've collaborated with some of you directly or indirectly in the past. And so it's really a pleasure to get to talk with you. And so I'm going to share some recent work that I've been doing with other collaborators related to these two questions, the who and how of landscape diversification and how we might think about trying to achieve the outcomes that we really want to see from our agriculture and environment. And so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about myself. Since you invited me, I feel like I will indulge you all in my personal story because I think it is relevant for, you know, potentially the students too who are on just, you know, my journey. And I'm going to weave some of my personal story into the work I've done. And so, you know, briefly about me, I grew up near the beach, near the Atlantic Ocean, near Atlantic City, New Jersey. And I did my undergraduate at Fordham University. I was a biology major. I started pre-med, as many ambitious biology undergraduates do. I realized kind of after about halfway through undergrad that I didn't want to be a doctor, and there was not a lot of mentorship around what else you might do in terms of career trajectory. And so I worked for a few years after undergrad doing kind of unrelated work in marketing and sales in New York before I went and got my master's at Columbia University in applied climate science. And I always had kind of an interest in the natural world. And so maybe that makes more sense why I've always been excited about the name of your department and the work that you're all doing. So I had an opportunity at Columbia to study under some of the, you know, really preeminent earth scientists in the United States that inspired me to want to go on and get a PhD and continue doing work in the climate and agriculture space, because you learn about climate and climate change, and it's this, you know, huge wicked problem, and how am I going to make some contribution in my life and career toward it? And I decided that agriculture, natural resource conservation, food production, those were all things I was really excited about, worried about into the future. And so I moved to Ames, Iowa in 2011 from New York City and started my PhD at Iowa State, was a part of a great climate change and agriculture collaboration. I see Lindsay Peace here, was a few of the original graduate students on that project to participate in one of these big CAP initiatives around Midwest agriculture and climate change. And so I finished my PhD in 2015, started a policy fellowship with the Union of Concerned Scientists. I was there for 2 years, and then actually had worked for just a few months with USDA NIFA as a policy fellow before UNL said, please come and start teaching in the spring of 2018. And so that's what I did. And actually my partner, Erin, is originally from Nebraska, grew up in a large commercial ranch in the Sandhills of Nebraska. And so we met when we were both working and living in Iowa. And so that's how a New Jersey girl ends up in the beef state. And so I tell you all this because, you know, I am here because I chose to be here. And I feel like at every point when I moved from New York to Iowa, being from, you know, moving from DC to Nebraska, I always get these comments and these questions of like, well, why are you here? And I actually have grown to be somewhat defensive about that because it comes off to me a bit like you're not really welcome, like you're not from the same background as us. And so I try to be really sensitive to that and just take, you know, people's passion and interests and where they are for whatever it is. And so, you know, I just would say for all of us, and, you know, maybe especially for some of the earlier career and students, that, you know, I try to use my guiding values, which I'm showing you here, in terms of, you know, having compassion for people who might be, who might look at things a little differently. So trying to be open-minded. I take communication really I put a really high value on that too. I think that I have a lot of privilege and education in my life, and I have a responsibility to make what I do broadly relevant and try to work with others to do the same. And then really this conservation. So I try to keep it all in the C's, but related to climate, you know, I say climate is what motivates me in solving this wicked problem, and you know, why I really am here and doing what I do. And so I would just say, you know, I try to stay focused on these core values, and we all get pulled in a million different directions. But I wanted to share all that because I do think it informs a lot of my story and the type of work I've done and hope to continue to do. So thank you for indulging me for a few minutes and telling you about myself. And now I want to have a little poll, a little interactivity. So Amy, if you want to deploy the poll, I want to get us thinking about the who and the how, right? And so I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts. If you had to pick one factor of this whole list, who do you think, or what do you think is the most influential in on-farm decision-making? Let's just get a quick pulse on this. So we'll leave this up for a minute and we'll look at the results in just a minute. So there's about 35 of us, so I expect about 30 answers. That's what I do with my students too. Let's see how many we get. We got 25. Oh, out of 32 potential. Great. I know it might be hard. You only get to pick one. Okay, well, I'm going to move on to my next slide here, but Amy, you're welcome to close the poll whenever you want, and then we'll share the results in just a minute. Okay, well, we already have the results. All right, so let's see, 35%, that was the biggest bin, say farmers or producers, and then a real mix of others. So markets, crop insurance, consumer demand, landowners, a few, and a few on state and federal regulations. Okay, well, great. Let's keep that in mind, that the biggest bin was farmers, producers, and then a bit of a hodgepodge. Regulations get about 5 votes, so 16% total. But we'll keep that in mind as we move forward and think about, you know, just some of the work that I'm sharing, these 2 examples of recent work. But, you know, I'm not going to spend too much time here at the beginning of my presentation trying to convince all of you that there are a number of issues and challenges related to growing food and sustaining resources, right? So we know that water pollution is a major challenge that lots of time, energy, and monies have gone into, and you see many problems. This is a recent article from Minnesota, and I feel like I follow Minnesota issues kind of from afar with a bit of envy. I do think that your state has enacted some things and has some inertia to hopefully, you know, contribute to some of these solutions. But so I don't have to tell any of you water pollution is an issue related to crop production. And then something that I think a lot about and talk a lot about is just this challenge of soil erosion. And so this is a photo that I took during my PhD in Iowa, and I show it a lot. It is in these pillars, what you see in these kind of middle slabs is depicting the change in the depth of topsoil since, white settlement basically across the plains in the mid 19th century until the 21st century, and that is estimated to have declined in half. And so I'm showing a recent paper that maybe some of you have seen where they estimated the lifespan of soils. It's really interesting work. And they say that 16% of soils globally, so they created an estimate of a lifespan to be the top 12 inches of soil. And they say that 16% of global soils could be degraded within 100 years. But that with conservation and some of the things that I study and that many of you do as well, that those lifespan of soils could be extended significantly. And so this is me in the middle. This question I like to ask is just, we talk a lot about doubling food production by 2050. It's like, well, what about soil, right? I think that's an important, what will our soil resource look like at that time with a changing climate? So we know we can lose soil much more quickly than it forms and the longer timescales that takes. So that's water pollution, soil erosion. And then when we think about people and communities, right, I think it is, as someone, I teach undergraduates, I'm sure many of you do as well, that it is a really challenging time for beginning farmers and early career professionals, that we're looking at major land transition in the short term, but that this is occurring amidst, volatile situation in terms of commodity prices, input costs, farm consolidation. And so, what are the opportunities for beginning farmers, or for people who maybe don't have access to all the resources that one might if they were very fortunate to have grown up on a farm. So this is something that I think a lot about too, just in the future for my students, the majority of whom tell me they intend to farm in the future. So again, not trying to start by trying to convince all of you that conservation and diversification offer a lot of solutions to the challenges that we face. But I want to talk about, again, these two projects I dropped in the chat, two recent publications that I'm going to be referring to today, and just get us thinking about how are we investing our conservation dollars and who are we most often talking to? Okay, so what were the most popular responses that you had to that poll, right? So number one was farmers and producers, right? Oh, thank you for showing the results again, Amy. So that was 35%. So a third of you say that's the most important community of people. And I don't disagree with that. I think that population of people who tend to be mostly older male white operators, right? That's who we are frequently talking to when we're doing our work in conservation and extension and outreach. And I understand that those are people who are the most directly involved with what's happening on the land, right? So that's who we're most often, I think, talking to. And I'm certainly open to more discussion about this, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work I've done with women landowners at the end here, and why I think that they're an important population to be involved with. But then state and federal regulations in total make up 16%, and so I hope that and I agree that federal regulations, markets all have an important role in what's happening on the landscape. So I know that was tough to choose one, but I hopefully will give you some things to think about with this recent analysis that we've published on federal dollars, and specifically the EQIP program. So transitioning into the how question of the who and how. This is work that I have been doing for a few years now with a great group of collaborators, including one of my close friends and colleagues, Gabrielle Resch McNally, who was a graduate student colleague of mine. And we worked on, she taught me a lot about qualitative data and social science. We worked on a focus group project with farmers in Iowa, working on cover crops. And her and I kind of from that built an idea for this project, that we wrote a grant to have a team funded through the Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, if anyone is familiar with SYSYNC. And so we put this proposal together to try to map what we would say is the how and where of soil health related practices. And so one element of that is this analysis that I'm going to share with you, and we have some other work forthcoming. But what SYSYNC does is fund people to come together. And again, based on all the things I shared about myself, I've had always an interest in kind of doing interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary work, because I think that's how we really will solve problems. It's not just about, understanding how to optimize cover crops or anything biophysical, right? We know we have to talk to people and our responses of who are the ones making the decisions. And so the model of SYSYNC is that they fund teams to come together, and we started meeting as a group in September of 2018 and met 2 more times since then. We're lucky we got our 3 meetings in prior to all of this. And so I would say this has been a very collaborative project. And I think about multidisciplinary projects really in just how we can bring our brain power together and not just talk about, vocabulary or you're in this department, you're in that department, but it was really a collaborative effort, and so why were we interested in trying to think about conservation programs and kind of understanding where these things are occurring in the US? And, soil health is a very exciting topic, continues to get more and more exciting. Of course, we've have more discussion with the new presidential administration and within USDA around things like climate, soil. This has been going on for years, right? But there is opportunity for increased investment on a state and federal level around soil health. And so we thought that, trying to understand where these dollars are going could help affect potentially some of these new resources and how can they best optimize the benefits for society kind of at large. And so I wanted to, before I dive into what we analyze with the EQIP program, I wanted to start with just a big picture in terms of federal conservation programs. And so what I've done here, this is a table that I've adapted from a Congressional Research Service report where they break down where all these different dollars go in terms of conservation programs. And so the biggest bin that you see here is working lands programs. So working lands programs primarily are, it's about half of the total dollars that go into conservation programs, but EQIP and CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, and EQIP is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with it. So the majority of these, so this is where we wanted to focus. What are the dollars going directly into programs that are dedicated to actual working farmlands, not things like easements, land retirement? The CRP program is another one probably a lot of people are familiar with, and you can see where those fit in here. But that biggest bin is working lands, and in total, these dollars represent about 6.7 billion annually. And so again, we wanted to focus on the EQIP programs, which is again, just zooming out, working lands programs, EQIP is within that. But we wanted to focus on the EQIP program because it is one of the two major working lands programs. And this is probably the most important reason that we decided to focus on EQIP. And really with the succinct model of the team, they don't fund people to collect new data, they fund you to analyze existing data and try to pull kind of some disparate things together. And so when we had this question about like where and why is soil health happening, can we align and try to understand some of the more systemic policy barriers, we went looking for where's the data. And there really isn't enough of this data to my liking, but within the EQIP program, you can actually get data for the dollars and acres at a county level of individual practices. And so just, that language practice is something I'll use regularly here, but a practice means a specific management action or structure. That's the definition. And we were able to just do a public records request to get all of this information. And so because the EQIP program has a lot of good, well broken out data, we chose to go with it. There is an opportunity to get data like this for the CSP program, but it's much more complicated. And so this is what we went with. And so a couple other reasons we focused on the EQIP program is that it is estimated by different USDA reports that there are multiple times greater acres dedicated to this program that have the opportunity to improve soil health. And there was a recent Government Accountability Office report that found that there could be changes made to the program, guidance and recommendation tools, the ranking tools to try to optimize the environmental benefits. And so we hope that this kind of framework that we've provided in our analysis might help, support this last bullet point here. So I want to illustrate just again, like kind of zooming out, like bigger picture here, what we were interested in understanding in terms of the investment that's being made in practices that have the potential to improve soil and environmental health. And so if we think about the total USDA budget on an annual basis, we're talking about $144 billion. And I know well that the USDA budget is very complicated and involves a number of different programs, right? So it's 144 billion total. So I don't expect that all of this is going to go to the things that I'm perhaps most passionate about or that I study. There's a lot of important things clearly that the USDA supports. But this is where that bin of 6.7 billion falls for conservation programs. The EQIP program is about $1.9 billion allocated annually. And then this is the question that with this analysis that we really wanted to try to answer is what within that bin of EQIP are the practices that have the potential to provide the most optimal environmental outcomes. And so what we did to try to understand that last little circle was to develop a classification system to explain the potential outcomes around three different components. We'll call them soil health, adaptive strategy, and transition to ecologically based management. And I'm going to walk through what those all mean. And we used this website, the National Conservation Practice Standards website that you see here. I'm showing you on the right, and you are able to pull up descriptions of the different practices. So we classified all the different practices, about 200. Three of us primarily did that coding. And then we used that classification analysis to analyze about $7 billion of spending on these contracts over the most recent 10 years that we had data for between 2009 and 2018. And I want to say full disclosure, and I'm happy to answer questions about, anything in the classification scheme, but we fully recognize that every practice is going to be implemented. It's very site specific. It's very, management decision specific. So we know that just because something has the potential does not mean that it is achieving that or it's not achieving that, right? So, so we had to kind of make our best judgment and then go forward knowing that these are the things that we feel have the most potential. So let me tell you a little bit about our classification systems that we use. The first was just the type. So kind of like just a general description of what the practice is, or really the primary asset that the practice is targeting. And then the second classification that we used was soil health, but let me just qualify this here as says that we really wanted to focus on those practices that are happening kind of in the field, right? So these are meant to be working lands programs, but there's a number of things that are not really necessarily taking place within a working farm, forest, or ranch land. So that was our primary interest and focus. And then the second was the soil health outcome. And I'll show you how we ranked these in a way that we felt the practice had the potential to reduce erosion or disturbance and increase biodiversity. And then the third was a transition to ecologically based management, which we classified using the principles of agroecology, which I'm going to describe in more detail. And then the final is the adaptive strategy. And so this is essentially grouping practices based on a continuum, based on the potential to expand adaptive capacity or confer resilience on a field or farm. And so again, I'm just making that caveat that we fully recognize that these practices are going to get implemented in different ways. So the idea here is that we had the intention that the classifications would help us understand the potential for these practices to enhance soil health, increase adaptive capacity, and strengthen ecosystem health and function. And we do think that this classification overall gives us maybe like a new way of thinking about some of these practices and their potential outcomes. And so when we talk about principles of soil health, these are the 5 that are recognized as having the potential to improve the biological, physical, and chemical aspects of soil. And so I'm showing you these here. They're probably familiar to many of you. And this is a little picture of a whiteboard from one of our first meetings where this idea that I'll show you came to life. And so the idea was, how could we kind of group all of these practices together? And so what we did was come up with this matrix or these different quadrants based on axes of whether the practice was minimizing disturbance or erosion and increasing biodiversity. And again, yes, so we put these 5 practices together and felt that they fit kind of nicely into this axis system. And so this is an image from the publication, but you can see again what these quadrants look like in a more professional illustration. But so the idea is that this first quadrant is practices that represent kind of no change to soil health or maybe minor modifications. So something like what we're representing here, nutrient management, could have benefit, but maybe only a minor modification or opportunity to improve soil health. And then what we put into quadrant 2 was the low diversification, disturbance, or erosion quadrant, things like residue or tillage management, so where we're reducing disturbance, but not necessarily changing the diversity above ground. And then in quadrant 3, this is where we would have high diversification, but also high disturbance. So there weren't too many practices that fit into that category, but prescribed burning was one of them, just to give you an example. And these are all practices, the names of them represent exactly how you would find them in a conservation practice program like EQIP. And then the 4th quadrant, which we felt had the most potential to incorporate multiple aspects of soil health, is this quadrant for high diversification and low disturbance. So you can see silvopasture, so optimizing livestock and crop diversity. So that was the first of the classifications, or I guess second if you count type as one. But the second framework is trying to classify practices based on a continuum or their conversion to more ecologically based management. So we base this off of these principles of agroecology that are outlined in the Steve Gleasman agroecology textbook. And I think about the world when I think about different practices through this lens now. I think it's really insightful to think about, where our investments go and how are we grouping them, right? So the 3 categories, well, they actually have 5, but I'm showing you 3 here. They have kind of more tied to human systems as 4 and 5 as the, most optimal potential outcomes of agroecology. But if we think about just efficiency practices, right? So these are things that can improve the efficiency. So efficiency, I talk about this a lot in my class that's called resource efficient crop management. So what does efficiency mean? It means increasing productivity and reducing waste, which are great goals, right? But that is not necessarily the same as diversification or conservation, right? It's just about increasing or improving efficiency. So irrigation water management, what we're representing here, could be seen as something that is improving efficiency. The second level considered for agroecology is something like mulching, where we're substituting different inputs for things that might be less harmful than others. And then the third is really system redesign, where we're trying to transform really the whole kind of field, whole kind of cropping system, right? And so the idea is that as we move through this continuum, that we are trying to base our management on ecological principles. So things like reestablishing biological relationships that can occur naturally on the farm rather than reducing or simplifying them, or emphasizing conservation of soil, water, energy resources, right? And I want to also say here too, that, it's not to say, I don't like to say that we really ranked the practices. I like to think about that we tried to classify them, because it's not to say that any of these, like mulching or irrigation water management or efficiency or substitution, are bad per se, but just, again, giving us a different lens to see them through, that there's some things that have the potential to confer even more broader benefit than just, let's say efficiency or input substitution. So again, I don't like to think of this as a ranking, but more sort of a classification to get us thinking about some of these practices through different lenses. And then the final one I'll mention, I know it takes a lot of time to explain all these, but the dollars kind of flow really easily, was this idea of adaptive strategy, right? And so this is based off of USDA publication and other different like resilience thinking and adaptive capacity frameworks, where we're thinking about this, again, continuum of, does this practice represent a change to the ecology or to the structure and function of the system? And so these are the way, the language that they use in these kind of frameworks is resistance, resilience, and transformation. And so the idea is that they're representing less to more change to the structure and function. And so things like drainage water management, right? That this is a strategy that is typically an intervention that targets technology or is not really changing kind of the whole structure of a system. The resilience framework is one where you could describe the form and function of the ecosystem is adapted to try to buffer the effects without a major change to the system. And then the idea of transformation is that these are strategies that facilitate a transition of the agroecosystem to something that's different in its structure and function to be better suited for sustaining production into projected changes. So again, it's more of a continuum, and not to say that any of these are more better or worse, but just that this is a continuum really, again, around the ecology and the structure and function of how these are impacting fields or farms. Okay, so those are the 4 different type and then those 3 different classification systems. So I want to show you now kind of the punchline with the dollars and where things are, what we found things were going to predominantly in the last 10 years in the EQIP program, right? So the actual largest bin, just in terms of type, is actually facilities or structures. That this is about $3.5 billion or 51% of the total funds that we analyzed. And then the next biggest bin were the managed land, which was the ones that we were the most interested in for this analysis. It's about 39% of the total. And then those others, the boundary practices, so maybe more, you might think of like edge of field or border type practices, monitoring or conservation plans are just about 10% total. So that's where the type practices go. So that actually, not even half of the practices are actually, according to our classification, happening on, you know, the field in managed or boundary type practices, which was surprising kind of right off the bat for us. And then when we look at where the dollars are going in the soil health classification, I'm kind of giving away the punchline right here at the top that more than half of the practices we didn't even classify for soil health because based on their descriptions, which is what we were going off of, they didn't really have a direct impact on soil health. And so when we think about this in the different quadrants, if we look at 1, 2, and 3, they represent 9%, 15%, and about 1% of the total. Like I said, that quadrant 3 didn't have a lot that fit into the high diversity and high disturbance. But we did find that about 22% of the total did fall into practices that we classified in quadrant 4, which again, we felt took advantage of most of the principles of soil, or the most principles of soil health. So that's where things shook out. So those numbers don't add up to 100 because I don't have them all because so many didn't actually even have relevance, as so many are kind of more structural practices that didn't have a direct impact on soil health. And then I'm showing you here in terms of the transition to ecologically based management. So again, these numbers don't quite add up to 100 either because there were many that we just felt we couldn't classify within this category, but you can see that about half of them do fit into this improved efficiency, which makes total sense to me in terms of just, you know, what I observed from some of these programs, but that only about a quarter or so were going to the system redesign practices, which we do feel have the most complexity, most diversification, the most potential opportunity to improve broadly soil and environmental health. So there was a lot of overlap in the system redesign practices, and quadrant 4 are the most optimal, most soil health related practices incorporated. And then finally, you see the numbers here in terms of adaptive strategy. So this is there was kind of less overlap, I would say, with the classification of these practices. That majority did fall into the resistance category. Some, you know, significant percentage, 20% or 1 in 5 fit into the resilience category, and then just 2%, small amount that we felt fit kind of that description of transformation. Again, those practices that are really substantially impacting the structure and function in an ecological way to support projected change into the future. So yeah, a number that don't support directly soil health. And I'm caveating all of these things because I know that the way we looked at this, and we talk about this a lot in the paper, that it is difficult to infer the context with which that practice is incorporated. So if a contract for EQIP includes a few things, that are being utilized together. Of course, we're not able to capture that with the way the data is broken out. But when we just look at it practice by practice, this is what we've found. And so coming back to just the overall pie of USDA spending, you know, what did we find and how this all fit together, right? So we found that these practices that improve soil health or expand adaptive capacity or represent transition to more ecologically based management represent about 2 to 23% of EQIP funding over the most recent 10 years, which represents a very small fraction of the overall USDA budget. And since we've written this paper, we had a nice article written in Civil Eats about this work. We did get a little commentary from folks who said, oh, well, it's, you know, the context of putting this into the whole budget is not a fair comparison, which we totally understand. And we were meaning to just show these overall dollars because I think that so by and large, we're all taxpayers, right? That we don't always recognize like how much is being spent on different things. So I think contextualizing what this number represents against the total is really what our goal was here. And the title of the article really, I think, summarizes our main conclusion here is that, you know, when I think about the how question, so again, this is just one analysis of one working lands program within a whole bigger suite of funding that is spent by federal or state partners on conservation. So this is not the end all be all, we fully recognize that, but we do feel that, you know, in terms of the way our dollars are spent, that there is a lot of untapped potential in our current programs. There are already mechanisms in place. There's already mechanisms in place to support these practices, and we do feel that there is greater opportunity to improve the broader benefit from them. So that's kind of the main take home, I would say, from the how part of my question in the title, that, you know, there's more room. I think that these kind of programs could be optimized to support the broader public benefit that I think many of us would like to see. Okay, so that was the majority of what I wanted to share. I just have a few slides left about some work, as I've already mentioned, I've been doing with women landowners. And so this is just, you know, again, I'm not saying that my work is the end all be all of all the potential good ideas that are out there to solve these challenges, but just framing it in a way to think about, you know, who are we commonly talking to, right? And so there is a lot of interest in working with non-operator landowners, because we know that about 40% of farm and ranch land is operated by someone other than the primary owner. And so this is a project that my other close friend, sociologist, friend from graduate school, Angie Carter, who's a sociologist at Michigan Tech University, we put together about 2 years ago now a small SARE partnership grant to work with women landowners in Nebraska. And there really hadn't been a lot of work done with women landowners in my state. And we thought it was a really interesting one to try to look at what is the opportunity for women landowners to potentially support conservation. And so 42% of the land in our state is owned or co-owned by women. And Nebraska is the 4th state for total ag output. We're kind of in an interesting place in terms of being a major cattle producing state and still having significant small grain acres in wheat, as well as corn and soybean, which are the predominant crops that are grown in the state, which is probably no surprise in Minnesota. But we know that meeting conservation goals, you know, if we say 40% of land is operated by someone other than the main owner, that leaves a lot of opportunity to see how landowners can support that, and that women have been really historically excluded from a lot of these conversations just because of the, you know, pervasive sexism in our society. That's really what it comes down to with a lot of these situations, even within families, right? And so the question here that we wanted to work with was, you know, specifically, how are we training future ag and natural resource professionals to think about some of these complex social and familial dynamics behind land transition and land management, right? So as I mentioned already, you know, many of my students, I'm sure many of your students, are intending to farm into the future. And so how are they grappling with some of these things in their own lives, and what's the opportunity potentially to involve another voice? And so I'll tell you just a little bit about the project and some of the things we found. And so we had a paper published recently in Natural Sciences Education about the student perceptions of these case studies that we worked with. So we, through this AIR partnership grant, supported kind of a case study approach of working with 3 women landowners in eastern Nebraska and northwest Missouri, all Nebraska women landowners, but one that had land in northwest Missouri, and their male tenant operators, to work with my fall capstone course. So I teach a course with mostly senior agronomy majors where we visit farms and we talk to them about their goals and challenges, and then we work over the course of the semester on a farm improvement plan. And so this was the second time I taught the course in the fall of 2019. And we partnered with these 3 different case studies, visited them in the summer of 2019, in August of 2019, after Angie and I had interviewed the farmers and landowners earlier that summer. And then the students presented their reports to everyone. Everyone came to Lincoln for the presentations when we used to do those things in person in December of 2019. And I had the opportunity last year in person in February and then online in July to present some of this work, Angie and I, with some of our collaborators. And so you can look more at some of the student perceptions. And I think it is really interesting because I think it does beg the question for us about how are we approaching some of these different voices that we could be bringing in, and are we training future professionals to think about things through this lens? And so I'll show you some of the really, I just have 2 really nice quotes to share from some of the really positive learnings that students reflected on, and that they certainly recognize the value that incorporating landowners has to play. They know that intuitively from their own experience and seeing some of the, these are relationships that we're not always in agreement on all the goals, that this is really important for long-term viability of operations, this human dimension. And I'm sure many of you can relate to that on a professional and or personal level. So they know that this is complex and that these conversations are happening every day. I thought this was a really nice quote from a student, and this has to do with conservation, right? And this I thought was just a really beautiful quote from one of the students too, that this project did shift their perceptions, that there is, whether it's a woman or a man who's a landowner, I think students and many people feel that non-operator landowners just want to check. So a lot of people told us that in their work, that they're not really interested in it. And that certainly could be the case, but there are definitely people who want to be involved. And so I thought this was a great quote, that these women, even if they're away, that they care very deeply. I think that is really well said in terms of, the role that working with landowners, non-operator landowners can have for, supporting tenants to do, to diversify or do more conservation. And so this is the same prompt that I showed all of you in the poll. This was the students' responses to your impressions. They got to rank them. I didn't ask you to rank them. I just asked you to pick one. But they came out right at the top here in terms of who is the most influential in decision-making as producers, right? Or then they say agronomists or consultants, markets really being important before we get down to landowners. And so I think that is a really common perception. It is predominantly who we're talking to. It tends to be the white male operators, and that's the majority of operators and landowners really in our country. So I want to just show the positive things that have happened here between the landowner collaborators. And this is still ongoing. We actually had intended to interview everyone in the case studies last summer. Andy was going to come back to Nebraska and do that, but of course it didn't happen. So there's been some evolving things. I've been in communication with several landowners recently, and through these conferences and other opportunities. And so their relationships are evolving based on some of the, I would call it kind of complex mediation that my students provided right through this case study approach. But what I want to share is that, I know this is a small sample size. This was 3 case studies, but all 3 of these landowners did take conservation action after our intervention. Intervention sounds like there's something wrong, but after this kind of complex mediation, right? And so one mother and daughter pair, they're trying to get her daughter more involved in kind of ownership and trying to look at some small business diversification opportunities. And so they have actually started some rotational sheep grazing. They have another CRP contract. They've been considering with their tenant a crop share agreement, which actually the Northwest Missouri farm has a crop share agreement, which works really well for them. And it has, this landowner is really involved in their operation. And so, and she actually, they had, because it was 2019, lots of flooding across and one of the wettest years ever. So there were some areas that were flooded on that field. And after a consultation and more thinking, they actually went out and initiated a new EQIP contract for a grass waterway around that flooded area. And another one here in kind of north central Nebraska, they initiated a grass buffer in an eroded area, and they took that land out of the lease. And so, and have been considering some changes to their lease as well, to have that lease be longer term. And so, and this landowner in particular has expressed in some of her presentations and to me directly that she's just felt really affirmed by the experience of getting to work with this project and being heard. Just, you know, what she has this vision of her land, and she grew up on that land, and they don't live there full time now, but you can see their nice little farmstead where they go and visit, and they have a big garden in the front. And just that sense of, again, personal affirmation of being heard and having more perspective and more learning about the challenges that their tenants face, because we know, production agriculture right now is not simple. So yeah, just some of my kind of closing ideas here and tying this all together. We know that we spend billions of dollars on conservation programs, crop insurance, other mechanisms, and we still see a number of challenges. It's hard to predict what will make individual farmers change behavior. And I say that because I think there's so much energy we put into that farmer operator. What is the behavior that's going to make them change? And yet I think that there's, obviously these challenges that exist, and, potential mechanisms that we already have in place in terms of the people and the policies that could lead to different outcomes, including the EQIP program analysis that I've mentioned in terms of its untapped potential. And again, I think that we really do tend to focus on farmer operators, and then there's many people who want to have their voice heard, right? Who are so interested and passionate about these issues in their land, but they've been systematically excluded from these conversations. And I do think that we have a responsibility to think about these voices, think about these policies and how we, train into the future and do our own work. So I will leave it there. I've probably talked enough. I think we've still got a little bit of time for questions, and I appreciate your good attention and any comments or questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was wonderful. If there are questions, folks can either type them into the chat, or you're welcome to just unmute and ask directly if you prefer. I'll keep an eye on the chat. Oh, here's one question. Have you followed the work of Land Stewardship Project, which has similar goals?
I'm a little bit familiar with the Land Stewardship Project, but feel free, Les, to unmute yourself and share more about their work. I made the comment really briefly about Minnesota Envy, but I feel like you have so much potential there, and so many great organizations, and even within the university and your Forever Green initiative, and folks like the Land Stewardship Project and so many other nonprofits. Like I said, I have a little bit of envy because I think there's a lot of good work. So I haven't followed it closely, but feel free to share more about it. I know there are a lot of groups in general. My colleague Gabrielle Resch is working with non-operator landowners with the American Farmland Trust. So feel free if you want to add anything. Thank you for your comment and question, Lindsay. Did we find the women who participated? Oh, how did we find them? Do you have any recommendations for reaching these landowners? It's a great question. So we worked with the Center for Rural Affairs in Nebraska, which has been doing work with women landowners. And so we put out a call to them, and they helped find them. And maybe the Land Stewardship Project or other organizations in Minnesota who are doing that work. I think for, what I understand of the work that you're doing, I think that probably people will be so eager to see a woman in extension presenting work. I really do. I think that if you can find them, and maybe it's through these organizations, they would feel more welcome in spaces if they know that women are presenting. I don't know, I'm kind of speculating here, but I don't always know. I'll be honest, I've said this to you before, that I sometimes go to extension events and I don't always feel welcome. I feel like there's so few women in the room, or it's just not a space that's really there for learning and sharing, that it's a lot of talking at versus discussion. And so we talk about that a little bit in the paper too, just that there are some approaches that have been found to be more successful working with non-operator landowners. So that would be my general advice, but it's a challenge.
All right, other questions? I see Deborah Allen put a comment in the chat that Land Stewardship Project does work with women landowners.
Kelly, this is Tish Gupta. I got a question for Andrea.
Sure.
You showed that pie diagram where you said how much money is spent by USDA, and then 0.03 to 0.3% is used for soil health. Do you know how much of the money, USDA money, goes for food stamps?
So yeah, right. I don't know off the top of my head, but I know that it is a significant percentage of food assistance programs, right? And so I do understand that our placing that percentage is meant to just put it in context of, it's still billions of dollars that are spent. But USDA is a complex agency that spends money on a lot of things. So I want to, it's a significant portion of the USDA budget that goes to food assistance programs. I don't know the percent off the top of my head.
Would you consider redrawing or adding another pie chart where you show just the things that are directly impacted by the production system?
Yeah, so, we tried to break the percentages down in a couple of different ways. And so the percentages that I showed on those first several slides before the overall pie chart was showing that, I think it's 22% of the EQIP program dollars are going to those practices with the most potential to improve soil health. So that's maybe more apples to apples.
I think the way you have the pie chart shown, it just kind of gives a wrong impression of USDA is wasting money and not using it for conservation. That's what the role should be. Anyway, that's my comment. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it. Thank you. So Les mentions Chuck Francis. Yes, he is still working and going strong, and we are in pretty regular communication about many things.
I was just wondering about your thoughts on the whole push right now for carbon credits and how useful that will be in the long term. And I have not looked at it in a lot of detail. I just hear it all the time now. And I wonder also, how is this different than what we had 10 years ago? I remember that there was a lot of talk about carbon credits, and then it died off. And now we're starting to hear again. And is this just a fad? Is it going to really make a difference? Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. I have mixed feelings, to be honest, about it. I worry that some of these markets are going to be really complex and not necessarily transfer dollars to farmers and not necessarily lead to the outcomes that we want to see. So I have mixed feelings, to be honest. I think that why it's different now is that compared to when these conversations might have, I mean, I understand, actually there's an ag journalist named Chris Clayton who wrote a book called The Elephant in the Cornfield, and he broke down a lot of the politics around carbon markets. He published it in 2015. So I read it several years ago now, but there was a big push against from major groups like the Farm Bureau, who didn't want to see any kind of regulation. And I think you see groups like that now kind of, I think, I don't know what their motivation is necessarily for wanting to be involved, but I think you have, 10 to 15 more years of climate becoming a major campaign issue, a major social issue. And I think there's just more wide recognition that like, this is not going away. And like, if I think agriculture is right to try to figure out how it can use that inertia. I don't know, with some of the carbon discussion though, I remain a little skeptical about how beneficial it's going to be. So I think it's important that if these programs do take off, that they can be structured in a way that actually supports the farmer and leads to the outcomes that we want to see, or else like we run the risk. I worry that in 10 or 15 years, we're going to realize like we invested all this time and brain power into something that wasn't going to be that beneficial. So maybe we'll talk in 10 years about it.
Yeah. And to that point, I think that there is some fatigue from farmers. You were talking about what makes farmers change practices and stuff like that. And I feel that there is, I work in extension, I work with farmers a lot, that there is fatigue because we always come up with these great ideas that will save the world. And we really incentivize them or encourage them to do all these things, and they change them. And then 5 years later, we come and say, well, no, that doesn't really work. Let's do this thing. This is the best thing. And we keep changing things all the time. And I think, there's that fatigue in the people that are actually doing the work to make the changes.
I agree. I think that's well said. Yeah. And I also think if these markets and things are not transparent, that's going to be a huge problem too. So there's, hopefully that's being taken into consideration, but thank you for that question and comment.
Thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, I see Carol had a question in the chat about if we did the work with the women landowners and collaborations with the soil and water conservation districts. We worked with local NRCS, and our local NRCS is usually closely tied into the natural resource districts. So yeah, we have natural resource districts in Nebraska, which are tied to watersheds and not counties, which is something we're like really proud of. So there was some involvement, and actually the case study that I'm doing now with my class is we didn't continue with this group. That was just for 2019. We're working with an NRD in Northeast Nebraska. So I have had my students involved with just trying to get a better sense of governance. I don't know that that's always apparent to them. I don't know if it would have been apparent to me when I was an undergraduate either. So I see a comment in the chat too about work that Iowa State Extension has done about women in crop production, conservation, decision making. Yeah, there's a lot of efforts around that. I think that's great. I think that there's certainly an element of learning that can be done, but I also think that there is an important role of listening to landowners as well, that it's not just about teaching them, that it's about that they deserve to be heard. And it's not just that, and there was definitely some quotes, if you look in our paper, from students feeling like, oh, well, the landowners need to learn a little more. And I kind of bristle at that a little bit because I think that is potentially true, but I also think that there's a listening that needs to happen. And so it does, to me, go both ways. But I appreciate you sharing that. I know, like I said, there's a lot of good work that's ongoing with women landowners, and I don't think our project with 3 women is a end all be all necessarily, but positive 100% change from it.
I see there's one more resource that Anna Cates shared a little bit up in the chat about how to design extension spaces, an article about how to design extension spaces for knowledge co-production.
Cool.
So there's a link there. So it looks like we're at time. Hopefully that covered everyone's questions. Thank you so much again, Andrea, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And Andrea's talk will be available on the website soon. There'll be a link there. So you can forward that to anyone who may have missed this presentation, and hopefully we'll see many of you back here in 2 weeks. Okay, thanks again.